Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone. And first, I want to say how exciting it is that so many attendees have come to the session today. This presentation and discussion is titled From Inclusive Leadership to Advancing Equity with Mark Puente. And it's hosted by ACRL Instruction Sections Management and Leadership Committee. And so I'm Clarence Maybee, and I am the Information Literacy Specialist at Purdue University. My partner in crime is Stephanie Crowe, Coordinator of Liaison Librarian Services at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And so I have the great pleasure actually of introducing Mark this afternoon. And Stephanie will monitor the chat and monitor the questions, or I'll help her with that because I think there's a lot of us. And so we'll do our best to feed questions to Mark during the question and answer period. And so please put them in we want to put them in the question, not just in the chat. Is that correct, Stephanie? But in the question answer.
Sure. Yeah, I guess let's do that. Let's try to put them in the Q&A, but I'll monitor the chat also. So if something ends up in there, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So just please list your question, and then we'll read it off to Mark when we get to the question and answer period. Okay. So Mark Puente is our speaker today, and he recently came to Purdue. So I've been getting to know him better in the last few months. At Purdue, he's in a new position, the Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Inclusion, and Diversity, and we're really excited to have him. Mark started his career in libraries as a music librarian, but I think a lot of us know him as the Director of Diversity and Leadership Programs at the Association of Research Libraries, or ARL, right, where he was for the last 11 years before he came to us at Purdue. So Mark has a really broad range of experience designing and managing programs that specifically focus on diversity recruitment and retention, addressing and improving organizational climates, leadership development, and racial equity. And he's also involved or serves in an advisory capacity on several leadership development programs, including the Association of Academic Health Sciences Libraries Leadership Fellows Program, and ARL's Leadership and Career Development Program, and also the ARL Leadership Fellows Program. So I think in summary, so I'm giving a very brief sort of introduction to Mark, but I think, you can see that he's done a lot of work in this area. And so that's why we thought he would be the perfect speaker and presenter, and also get a discussion going around these issues of leadership and management around issues of equity in libraries. And he's worked extensively on a more individual basis with libraries, archives, and other organizations, both in the United States and Canada for many years, in developing strategies for accelerating change in organizational culture. So he brings a lot today to this talk with us. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Mark. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Clarence, for that terrific introduction, and thanks to ACRL, to Stephanie and Lauren for all of the help in getting this together. I am going to get started here by acknowledging a couple of things, and the first of which is that reflecting on the modality here, this webinar platform, it gives me it makes me anxious to think about a group of instruction librarians or a bunch of teachers within this virtual space and basically talking to you all for an hour. I hope it's not an hour of me just talking to you. I hope that there will be some engagement and some good questions. I will take some pauses along the way as I walk through the content, but most importantly, I'm really excited to share the things that I've been working on, some of the tools and theories that I've taken to other organizations, institutions, and other communities of practice. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen if I can pull up my slides. Okay, are y'all seeing the slides okay? Yep. Okay. So let's get started. Thank you again for your presence here. We get invited to an awful lot of these things. I totally understand, and you can you can choose which ones you want to attend and what have you. So I'm delighted to have you all engaged and participating today. I do want to start off with a bit of what we call a land acknowledgement. When I started at ARL, well, we at ARL started doing this a couple of years back, largely because our organization is representative of institutions both in the US and in Canada. So we were taking the lead of our Canadian institutions who got into a habit of acknowledging the land on which we were meeting. And this is a virtual space, so I'm going to acknowledge the land from which I am presenting today, which is in the greater Chicago area, which is on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi tribes. Until the early 1800s, this area was also a site of trade and gathering and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes. The state of Illinois itself is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the greater Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban native communities in the US. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, the Miami, the Inoka, the Menominee, the Sac, the Fox, and their descendants. So we take this time to make this land acknowledgement. I realize it's not something necessarily that we in the US are accustomed to doing a great deal, but we do it to recognize that Indigenous peoples were the traditional stewards of this land that we now occupy. And they were living here long before Chicago was a city, and in many respects are still thriving here today. But all of us who live and work, who play and who worship on these territories really, I think it benefits us all to ask ourselves what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence, and support the struggles of Indigenous communities for their self-determination and their sovereignty. So I wanted to take just a moment to share that with you. I'll talk very, very briefly, and I'm using this particular set of norms intentionally because I'm actually going to reference this a little bit later when we start talking about frameworks around equity, particularly frameworks that focus on an anti-racist, building an anti-racist culture, an anti-racist agenda. But these are suggested norms from a source, Open Source Leadership Strategies, and I will reference some to practitioners who use these quite frequently. And I assume that we're going to be sharing these slides with the participants later. Good, because I want to share the wealth with all of you. But this is just a suggested set of norms for our engagement today. And whenever we're doing the hard work of thinking about inclusion, of thinking about equity, and I walk through them very, very quickly, and that is to speak your truth, to speak from the I, and not to make broad generalizations, right? That other assumptions about other people's values and the way these experiences interplay in other people's lives. This is really critical to lean into discomfort and into each other. This is something that we within professional contexts avoid doing. We avoid discomfort, but we have to acknowledge, and I hope we can all acknowledge in this space, that actually growth comes from discomfort, and that very frequently but people have to be in a position of discomfort or something that is new to them in order for there to be authentic growth. And so we want to position ourselves to be present in that space of discomfort, but also to be present to one another. If there are concepts that I present or that come out in the discussion that are very difficult, that lead to emotion, that we are good colleagues and compassionate colleagues to one another. That we commit to non-closure. Now that's not non-disclosure. That's not disclosure is around the idea of oh, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought, of confidentiality. Sorry, that fancy word, around confidentiality. But commit to non-closure just offers up that we're not going to come up with the answers, right? We don't have a magic formula for fixing whatever the issues are, the problems of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our professional spaces. But we want to embark upon a conversation and to think about concrete strategies for making improvements there. And also embracing paradox. And this is a deliberately countercultural approach to thinking about these issues, and thinking about the fact that quite often people's world experiences mean that they view sometimes the same data pieces, the same sorts of behaviors or the same information in very, very different ways. This isn't, however, just as a caveat, this isn't a good people on both sides sort of argument. It's just understanding that our worldview really influences how we see things and the way we engage the world. And then lastly, seek intentional learning and not perfection. I say almost on a daily basis that this is not a destination, that this is a journey that I hope that we can all be on together. There are many other frameworks. I was saw that ACRL presentation, I think that was given last week by Twana Hodge and Charita Anantechai. Sorry, I messed that up. Oh, sorry, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. But anyway, that presented something around a brave space. There are many, many great models. I just offer this for you today. And these are norms. These aren't rules, but no one's going to take responsibility for policing these as rules. So I hope you will feel comfortable engaging in this way today. I want to start off after all of that introduction with a sort of a story, an analogy. And I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this particular analysis. And a lot of the content, or at least some of the content that I'm going to bring to you today, it actually comes out of my experience, my own journey of development, engaging with an organization out of Greensboro, North Carolina called the Racial Equity Institute. They do have lots of professional development opportunities, and they do really terrific work. And so they have developed this concept of the groundwater analysis. So I want you to imagine for a minute, or for a couple of minutes here, that you're a landowner, and it's not necessarily terribly urban. You have a little bit of land, and you have some lovely trees, and on this piece of land you have you have a pond. Right. And so you've made it a habit to walk by the pond on a daily basis, maybe several times a day. And you've noticed in your journeys, in your walks across your property, that fish are coming up to the surface, that fish are actually dying. Okay. And so there's a problem here. You recognize there's a problem here. And so what is it that you're going to do? What are you going to wonder? Well, is some outside force coming in and killing the fish and just leaving them there, right? So you take the fish out, maybe you just take the fish out. Okay, there's some dead fish. And then the next day you do the same walk, and lo and behold, there are more dead fish. Okay, well, so you notice that there's a recurring problem here. And so how do you address that? Well, okay, you could do a couple of things. Again, you could just take out the fish again and hope that no more fish die. You could drive over to your local fish supply store and buy a bucket of fish, and you could add them again back to your pond in order to repopulate the pond with the hope that more fish won't die. What other options do you have, right? Do you have the option of training your fish to be like ducks so that they're surviving on the top layer of the pond rather than being immersed in the water? What is it? So this groundwater analysis, and we could spend a lot of time on this, is thinking about particularly what is it inside the water that is killing the fish? Okay. Do you, as the landowner, as the pond owner, take out the water? and do an analysis of the water to see what are the toxins, what are the things that are killing the fish, that are leading to the demise of so many fish. What does that look like? And so, so this is analogous to what we have been doing for many, many years with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, I will say racial justice, okay? What we have been doing is we have been trying to fix fish, okay? That we have been trying to incorporate and recruit whatever it is, whether it's women, when we're thinking about maybe women involved in the voting rights and in civic engagement, whether we're talking about recruiting people of color into the profession, right? So what we do is we set up programs. We set up these scholarship programs. We set up mentoring programs in a higher education context. We set up all of these programs to basically provide interventions for the deficits that these people have, that the fish have, right? And so there's some great literature out there by the Racial Equity Institute that I would like to point you to, and they have this particular groundwater analysis that describes it much more eloquently and much more detailed than what I have here. But the core of this, the moral of this story is that unfortunately we as a profession, and there's really nothing unusual, there's nothing unique to this particular profession, because many sectors have been concentrating on this fish fixing strategy as a way to diversify the profession. And we can talk about this. We can, happy to answer some questions about that. But what we want to get away with, and the moral of this entire story, if you don't make it to the final last few minutes of this, is that we really need to rethink what this strategy is. That, to think about the groundwater as being the source of the toxins, and to think about your pond as being connected on your property, being connected to all water sources, right, through the larger ecosystem, and positioning ourselves to think specifically about those toxins, to think about the things that are killing the fish, that are putting the fish in a situation where they cannot possibly thrive. And so I realize that's kind of a heavy way to, to be thinking about this already. I want to just go on and tell you a little bit about me in case you think, wow, that's a pretty provocative opening, or maybe it's not so provocative, I don't know. But I think it's important for us to think about a trajectory, right? A path for growth and for development for us as leaders, for us in this particular profession. And I like to think of this as this continuum of conversion, where, as I'm looking at my screen, really the safe approach, the empirical approach is just to look at logic and to look at facts, right? And to really focus there, and not to be, or put us in a position where we're really challenging people, where we're maybe even in positions where people might think of us as adversarial, in order for people to bring more people on board, right? To get more people committed to the work that we do. Now, and seeking common ground. So that's that middle space on the top of this particular pyramid, and that has its purpose in many instances. But I just want to challenge people to think about where we are and where we have been as a profession, and the degree to which we have really focused on that common ground, maybe to our detriment. So much in trying to discover this common ground, that again, when we talk about those norms for learning and engagement, when we talk about embracing discomfort, that we actually have avoided this concept called eustress, which is the generative and productive stress that we often can engage and can position ourselves to be in. It's the runner's high, right? It's the coder's high, the person who's trying really, really hard to figure out the code, to fix the glitch in the computer program, the thing that really keeps us motivated, but never to the extent that we feel so overwhelmed that we go completely into fight or flight mode, that we completely disengage, okay? And with the other end of that, with this continuum of conversion being the radical, disruptive sorts of approaches, and unfortunately that we have seen very, very recently in our history, but we have seen throughout our history. You know, the Boston Tea Party, right? I mean, what would happen? What would have happened had that not radical and disruptive sort of approach been taken? So I position myself and try to think of myself as approaching this work with an ethos of compassion, right? An ethos of understanding, but also understanding again that discomfort and that eustress is really necessary for our collective growth. I'm going to frame, and I am, as you can tell, I have been framing a lot of this conversation around race and ethnicity. It's not that I don't care about other human dimensions, right? It's not that I don't care about LGBTQ plus populations. It's not that I don't care about the status of women in our workforce, or the disabled, or the status of veterans and that sort of thing. But there is a reason for the focus on race and ethnicity. One of them is because of this moment, right? Because of May 20th, 2020, and the disruptive, you know, all of the protests that have come out of protests regarding police brutality and the deaths of Black men and women at the hands of law enforcement, but also for these reasons, because historically, if we do an analysis of this, the playbook for every type of ism, every type of oppression that we have that exists, I say here in the US, but now that I know that we have Canadian folks on the call, also within the Canadian context, is around race. I mean, that is the playbook that people have used to oppress people, to subjugate people, and to keep people away from advantages and from equity. That the solution to any problem requires proximity to that problem. And again, I'm borrowing very liberally from what I have learned through the Racial Equity Institute, and that is and this is really sort of the fundamental, a quintessential issue or quandary, if you will, with people who do the work that I do, and something that keeps me up at night. Again, it's not that I don't care about other identities, right? It's not that I don't care about poor people or uneducated people, right? It's just that when we make diversity about everything, it often becomes about absolutely nothing, right? And we really have to keep our strategies focused on the particular outcomes around a particular issue. And so solutions have to, they require proximity. Also, that racial inequality is costing all of us in many, many ways, and in ways that we really don't see today. Also, that if we look at the data, race is the single most reliable indicator for outcomes as people interact with social system, be it education, be it K through 12, be it higher education, be it health services, be it the criminal justice service. It is the best indicator. Economic factors, in fact, social economic status, in fact, does not tell the entire story there. Race is a much better predictor of how people are going to fare through our systems. And also that the outcomes, you know, in spite of all of our interventions, in spite of all of the money we're throwing into diversity recruitment programs, right? All of the money that we're throwing into whatever programs, you know, around maternal health and, you know, these sorts of things, that the outcomes are only gradually improving. And in fact, across some measures, across some dimensions, are actually getting worse. When we think about things like generational wealth, when we think about economic advantage, and when we think about the criminal justice system, that in fact, there's lots of data, lots of studies that say across race, we're not getting any better. We're actually behind where we may have been when the civil rights movement started in many respects. So what are some of the strategies? What are some of the things that we can be thinking about? Some of the tools that we can engage with, to think about, to position ourselves to think about, and most importantly, to think about growing as leaders, to think about growing in our particular space, if that is in an educational setting, in an instructional setting, that sort of thing. I want to share this model with you, which is it's a fairly old model. It's been around for quite for quite a bit, coming out of a community of practice that we call the multiculturalists. This is called the Intercultural Development Continuum. There is actually an assessment that we use at Purdue that I used both in my leadership role at ARL and that the Purdue campus uses with a great frequency. And it's something that I would, if we want to think about individual measuring our growth and our own orientations toward inclusivity, in this case towards intercultural inclusivity, this is a great approach. There's a tool connected to this called the Intercultural Development Inventory. But this is a framework on which that is built. And it looks at these 5 sort of stages in a person's development and where they are in terms of having an intercultural or multicultural mindset. And I'm just going to walk through these very quickly. This is stuff that I've taken directly from a website. So I'm happy to share that citation with you. But we start off at the journey in a state of denial. Right? A state of denial of differences. And that denial mindset really reflects a more limited capability for understanding and most importantly for appropriately responding to cultural differences that are set aside in beliefs, in perceptions, and the values that people have, in behaviors and in emotional responses. So the stage of denial consists really of a disinterest in other cultures and a more active avoidance of cultural differences. And there are lots of people across the United States and Canada that can easily avoid difference, right? That don't ever have to be in a cultural context where there are a lot of people that are very different from them. So as we move along this continuum, we go into polarization. Polarization reflects an evaluative mindset about difference. And in this instance, it views cultural differences from a sort of us versus them mentality or perspective. Polarization can take the form of defense, as in like my cultural practices are superior to other cultural practices, or maybe through reversal, that other cultures are better than mine. So either way, that can be reflective. So within defense, cultural differences are often seen as divisive and threatening to one's own way of doing things. Minimization is another step along this particular trajectory, where it highlights the commonalities in both the human similarity, that is the basic needs that we all have, and what is called universalism, the universal values and principles that we share, and that those can often mask the deeper understanding of cultural differences when we seek to minimize those differences. And minimization itself can take 2 forms. Sometimes in minimization, what we are doing is highlighting the commonalities due to limited cultural self-understanding, which is more commonly experienced by, really frankly, dominant group members or majority group members within a cultural community. Or the other way this manifests is by highlighting the commonalities as a strategy for navigating the values and the practices largely determined, again, by the dominant cultural group. The way this comes out kind of colloquially is, I don't see difference. I don't see color. I don't see gender. I think a lot of us have, we may have lived some of that, or we may have been exposed to people who live with that particular framework. Finally, we're moving up into acceptance. With an acceptance orientation, individuals recognize and appreciate patterns of cultural difference and the commonality, both the differences and the commonalities in their own and other cultures. And in an acceptance orientation, what you have is curiosity to learn more about the cultural patterns of behavior that make sense within different cultural communities. So this involves, contrastive self-reflection between one's own culturally learned perceptions and behaviors, and the perceptions and practices of different cultural groups. So we are starting here to embrace the difference and to be genuinely curious about the difference and to want to understand the sources of those differences. And finally, we get to adaptation. So an adaptation orientation consists of both the cognitive frame shifting, that is shifting one cultural perspective, and behavioral code shifting. So changing the behaviors that we engage with in an authentic and culturally appropriate way. So adaptation enables deep cultural bridging across diverse communities using an increased repertoire of cultural frameworks and practices in navigating cultural commonalities and differences. Okay, so that's an awful lot. That was very, very heavy, I understand. Let me just pause, because that's what this looks like in an individual context. You know, when we think about our individual journey. I'm going to pivot here in just a second so that we can think about what this looks like in an organizational context. But I want to stop talking for a second to see if there's any question or comment that we think needs addressing, or what would be helpful to the conversation so far.
Two things.
Yeah.
First of all, I should have said this at the very beginning, and I apologize, but I put in the chat that we are going to be implementing progressive stacking with the Q&A. So if you are, if you self-identify as a Black or Indigenous person of color and would like to put an asterisk at the beginning of your question, please feel free to do so, and we will prioritize your question. And so there was sort of a procedural question. Is the chat going to be saved, Lauren? And will the chat also be provided? I am keeping note of the resources that are mentioned.
Great, thank you.
Just in
Stephanie.
case, but Lauren, do you know the answer to whether the chat will also be saved and provided to the attendees? Okay. Well, if we find out, we will let you know.
Okay.
Clarence, were you about to say something? Okay, there have been a couple questions. One question is, says from the chat, I think sometimes these classifications are used against groups. So if I say that I am Chicano because I want my history to also be acknowledged, can't someone say that I am polarizing or minimizing someone else's issues?
Yeah, yeah. And that is frequently used against us, right? Well, against those of us who identify in one way, shape, or form or another. I think when we think about, if I'm understanding the sort of the concept or the comment correctly, it can be. The issue with that stance is that it fails to recognize the differences that we have, both in terms of the way we navigate through the world, but most importantly, the way others perceive us, the way others behave around us, and most importantly, the way systems interact with us. You know, that it's very tricky. There is a big emphasis right now, granted, you know, because of so much that has happened, particularly in 2020, on anti-Blackness, on anti-Black racism. And I understand that, and I will be perfectly honest with you, speaking from the eye here, that I have had many communities come to me, well, not many, I'm sorry. There have been a couple of instances where people have had enough bravery to say, you know, I understand why there's an emphasis on anti-Blackness right now, but you know, we were you know, an enslaved peoples, or you know, my communities were lynched also, and that sort of thing. And shouldn't we be mindful of that as well? And that is absolutely true. I think that I think that there is something about the history of chattel slavery in the U.S. that cannot quite be compared to much of other, you know, to many other historical phenomenon. So, you know, it's tricky. I mean, there is some truth to that, but I think that part of embracing that discomfort is trying to understand that this isn't, you know, I'm going to use a pejorative term, and I'm sorry. I mean, it isn't a contest, right? I mean, we don't want to position ourselves in thinking that one group is more oppressed than the other, but we have to be mindful and reflective of the historical pieces and the historical trajectories that got us to where we are. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope it is. So.
Okay, we have another question.
Sure.
Is there a place on the continuum where there is a divergence where someone understands but rejects?
Yeah, I think that's towards the earlier part. Yeah, I think that's towards polarization, where where it's evaluative. where the concept is, my cultural practices are superior than other cultural practices. If we think about even how the construct of race was created, just worldwide, many hundreds of years ago, and actually justified by science, specious science. It was called craniometry, looking at crane sizes, that sort of thing, and that created a historical, not historical, a value system based on racial identity. Based on those things that I mean, I think that's reflective of this kind of hierarchy of racial value that is very much within that polarization. And I actually can take this further, and I'm planning to if we ever get there. we may not quite get there, but we'll try.
And I think one more question so
Sure.
far. Someone is wondering, why does the Intercultural Development Inventory use culture as opposed to race, and with the acknowledgement that there are some racist elements in some cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is, again, going back to the concept of proximity, that we're looking here at a multicultural sort of mindset. And there are many other ways to look at this, but this particular instrument is looking at that particular engagement across cultures. And you're absolutely right with respect to, again, there are dimensions, in my opinion, beyond this, that go beyond adaptation if we're going to be thinking about positioning ourselves and looking at specifically at racism as a phenomenon that in fact this continuum does not go far enough. Absolutely. So let me go on, if we will, because I want to give and maybe even if we have time to do a little bit of exercise. Oh gosh, I have way more content than I'm ever going to get through today. I hope that's okay. I want to share this particular model that I have found extremely helpful. My colleague at American University, Nikoth Goss, shared this particular model with me and did some research, around an ACRL conference using this particular model, the path from an exclusive club to inclusive organization. This comes from two organization development specialists, Judith Katz and Fred Miller. They are world renowned. They do tremendous work with Fortune 50 companies and that sort of thing. And if you can think about just transferring that intercultural development continuum over to this model, this looks at what this could be like in an organizational context. And the way they explain this is that group, and I'm going to really truncate this here, that organizations and institutions always begin as monocultural organizations, right? That people get together with people like them to establish an organization, like a higher education system, right? And that at some point in time that there is a recognition that there is no difference within the group, right? And that in fact, there may be opportunities early on to bring in others and to develop what they would classify as a passive club. So the normative is still the norms, the values of that originating group, but they are allowing difference. They are allowing, that's intentional, difference to come in order just to be reflective of that, to allow their influence to be on those folks, but it remains a passive club. Moving on to that, through this continuum, we're looking at symbolic difference, and that's looking at where we are when organizations and institutions build people who are different, but who have some authority, right? Who have some gravitas. And we're starting to build a collective of people within the organization that look different from the originators, and maybe that may have slightly different values or slightly different ways of knowing or preferences for getting things done. Those sorts of norms. And then we move from there into critical mass, where we start building representational numbers within an institution or with an organization, where maybe the norms and the framework of that original dominant group start weaning a little bit. And within there is a transition, and that growth is actually from the top of that hourglass to the bottom, right? Where we walk away from mere tolerating differences, maybe we might have done, or an institution might have done when we were at the passive club stage, and we're being more curious about difference and the value that the difference brings to the institution or to the organization. And finally, we're thinking about welcoming, right? Welcoming difference, trying to understand and appreciate cultural difference and other differences, and understanding what the contribution is, what the value added is to have that difference engaged and part of our institution and organization. And finally, to building an inclusive organization. And Miller and Katz would say that this is where we recognize difference, we honor difference, and we actually leverage difference for the sake of the mission of the institution and the organization. With the caveat, okay, and I'm thinking largely, well, I mean, this is very much, I think, a characteristic of higher education in the United States and in Canada, is that there is a difference when we're bringing in difference by internationalization, right? By bringing in global, international students in order to diversify, and not really tending to the business at home, not tending to the business of why within our own cultures that BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, other people of color, as an example, don't have access to higher ed institutions in the way that people from majority cultures and identities do. So with that kind of caveat there. So how are we doing on time? I wanted to let's do this very quickly, just as a change, if we could. I'm going to ask everybody to, oops, sorry, to go very, very quickly to this website. Go to a different tab, if you will, on your computer, or go to your phone and go to www.menti, M-E-N-T-I, it's at the top of the slide, .com. And it's going to ask for a code, and then it will show on a not unfortunately on this horizontal axis, but on a vertical axis, all of these classifications. And my question to you is, where do you think libraries, archives, information organizations are along this path from exclusive club to inclusive organization?
Mark, let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
The code, oh, there we go. The code is displaying now. There are some.
Yeah, 3858437. Just very quickly. Okay, we have some dog, some exclusive club. Yep, passive club. Some at critical mass. This is fascinating. So keep doing it. Keep doing it. Some welcoming, that's great.
There are a few people asking if you could repeat the question.
Sure, yeah. Where along the path from exclusive club to inclusive organization do you feel libraries and archives are as an institution? Where are we as a collective along that path? One inclusive organization, that's excellent. That's good. Lots of passive club, lots of symbolic difference. Yeah, that says a lot, I think. I will say I've had colleagues who I referenced earlier that actually did this as a kinesthetic exercise, an exercise at a poster session at ACRL, and it was very interesting to see the difference in they had attendees put dots along their poster to indicate where they thought their organizations were. I think their library organizations, and there was quite a bit of difference in the assessments that communities of color were leaving, as opposed to those from majority cultures and identities. So I'll let you continue to that. I just hoping to do that as to kind of break up the talking. We can share that with you at the end. I can take a screenshot if you're interested in doing that. Good. Thank you for doing that. Okay, let me try to get back to my slides. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is where I was talking a little bit earlier about taking the continuum of intercultural proficiencies, taking it a step further. And I call this a developmental model for systemic change in equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, and I include anti-racism. And so it builds upon that framework, and I am adding 2 steps, and that is a re-envisioning part, where we often talk about the commitments to dismantling systems, dismantling oppressive systems, systems that have created disadvantage for communities of color, people from other historically underrepresented or marginalized identities, and then also about rebuilding. The problem again is, the difficulty in this is that we have really remained in that status from denial to adaptation. And as that previous exercise, I think, displayed to all of us, it's very, very difficult for us to position ourselves to think about reimagining and rebuilding problematic systems like, unfortunately, higher education systems that were built not as inclusive organizations from the onset, but were actually meant to keep knowledge and literacy and power within a particular population of people. So these are very difficult, and there are many models that we will get to, I hope, that we can talk about. I want to just talk very briefly about the buzz, and I don't mean the buzz in any pejorative way or in any kind of negative way, because there is so much being talked about, so much being written about and published about with respect to classroom engagement, to pedagogy, to the way we do our business. Certainly that you as a community of practice do our business in support of higher education and in support of teaching and learning. And there are many of these things, I think, and I would hope, are very familiar to many of you with respect to culturally responsive teaching or inclusive pedagogy, thinking about anti-racist pedagogy and trauma-informed teaching and pedagogy. That is something that I think we are really going to have to be thinking about as a collective as we think about re-entry into our communities post-pandemic. I think that it's going to be impossible to really gauge what the impact of the racial unrest and of course the impact of the pandemic is going to be on the constituencies that we serve, and thinking about critical pedagogy. Again, I don't necessarily need to walk through all of this. But there are many similarities, many differences across those terms. But I think one of the things, if we can just kind of walk away, also, by the way, to acknowledge so much good literature and so much good research, so much actively on the web that can help define and point to other resources that will help both define all of these terms and then also think about practically what these look like in everyday practice in the work that we do. I will say that as I've been researching these concepts and issues, that one of the most meaningful things I think that has come across and that is consistent across all of these models is the degree to which we engage the communities that we are serving, the communities that we're teaching, right? And engaging, not only making sure that our teaching content is representative of the cultural expressions and identities of the people that we're teaching and we're learning with, but that there is some agency, right? That the people that we are teaching and engaging with have some power in decision making with respect to, how are we going to gauge success? How are we going to engage in a way that includes their worldviews, includes their world experiences, and also exposes others maybe who have not had the same life experience, to that cultural difference. And so these are really, really critical. I think that thinking about the concept of trauma-informed teaching and pedagogy is really trying to position us as teachers, as instructors, as pedagogues, to have maximum impact and to really think about our teaching in a way that customizes the experience for students and for learners. And I realize that that is a heavy, heavy lift if we really think about that. You know, can we really customize teaching to, you know, the 60 people that are in our sphere of influence, that are attending our instruction classes and that sort of thing? But it's something to think about, and I encourage you to do some exploration about these. I'm just going to touch a little bit around some talking points around inclusive pedagogy, which of course is a big topic, right? And this particular model, or these particular talking points, come from from Catherine Ross, the executive director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia. And she reflects these as characteristics of inclusive pedagogy, as being grounded in deep reflective practice about our own biases, right? About our own assumptions, about our own positionality within these hierarchical structures if we are in a higher ed context. But it also is inclusive of those in K through 12 and other contexts, right? That it requires intentionality and the willingness to question long-standing practices, right? Is the way that we have done things the best way to do it? Are these culturally responsive, and if in some ways do our common practices actually help to sustain the long history of disadvantage for many communities of color, as a distinct example there. And also the examination of power and dynamics, both the power differentials that exist between students and instructors, that exist between the students and themselves. And this is my ad. And if we think about the power differential between institutions as a whole, as a phenomenon, as an entity, and those from marginalized identities. So I think it's really important. There's a lot of good stuff written about this. We only have time to kind of, you know, walk through this right now, unfortunately. I've cited Columbia and the Center for Teaching and Learning a lot. These again are their guide for inclusive teaching. We don't have time to go over it, but it's a terrific website. But I encountered so many terrific websites with great resource lists, and not only from the Columbias and the Browns and that sort of thing. There are some tremendous resources that are openly available from community college communities, from not-for-profit organizations that are working in K through 12 education and that sort of thing. So I'll let you just kind of sit there and maybe read over those. The idea of setting explicit student expectations is really, really critical here. And also consistent with what we think about when we think about trauma-informed approaches to teaching, so that we are very explicit about what the outcomes are. You know, is it really, do we disadvantage our own processes if we set our expectations just a little bit lower, you know, particularly within the context that we're in in this COVID environment, and that we're going to be coming out of, we hope, in a number of months. So let's look beyond, let's go beyond. And trauma-informed teaching, again, I referenced this a little bit, thinking about structuring courses or instruction sessions as clearly as possible, so that people really understand what the students really understand what the expectations are, right? And also being flexible should challenges arise. If students get very sick or stressed, you know, and if they turn in an assignment, either don't complete something or turn it in late, that doesn't mean that we're just giving them carte blanche, you know, but the possibility of mapping workarounds, so that they'll have an opportunity to make up what's missed. Lots of good, I cannot recommend the site more highly. We have just a few minutes, and I really want to spend some time and open this up again for questions and discussion. I think a lot of this conversation about these changing approaches, changing pedagogy, I think leads to where we are with respect to thinking about a pretty dramatic shift, a paradigm shift for access and equity. And for us to think about our cognitive frames, the cognitive frames from which we approach this work. This is something out of you know, Paul Gorski's work, Ed Exchange in the Multicultural Pavilion. And I've modified this a little bit, reflective of some of my own learning and development. But switching our approaches from equality to equity. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, are familiar with that. Changing our approach from thinking about equal distribution of all resources, right, which is the equality part of that, to equity in terms of assessing and providing the resources that people need to really succeed in our systems as they currently exist, and until those systems are rebuilt and reimagined for those who are not faring as well in those systems. If we get away from this deficit mindset of thinking about students as being at risk or disadvantage, right, to a broken system, right, that our systems were not built to accommodate those students who may come from under-resourced, schools and that sort of thing. To switch from the concept of colorblindness, we addressed this a little bit earlier, to acknowledging and honoring differences and understanding the unique perspectives that different folks with different identities have. I mean, even when I think about my own identity as a Latinx person, Latino, there are so many more. My experience is not the same and is not the same, generally speaking, as maybe those who identify as from Central America, Central American, San Salvador, El Salvador, or those Cuban Americans, right? So there is no identity that's a monolith, and so we need to be thinking about that. That we switch from learning about other cultures to dismantling systems of power and privilege, particularly where the power and privilege is just the assumption and that was bestowed on people just because of their identity and for no other reason. That we really move from the concept of celebrating diversity and advocating to advocating and fighting for equity. And that we focus on, we change our focus from intention and intent to impact. And those are familiar because, again, some of the programs that have been set up, particularly in the United States, when we think about something like affirmative action, when we think about measuring the impact of affirmative action on communities of color, that in fact, the demographic group that has benefited most, if we look across many measures from affirmative action, has actually been white women. And so there's a lot of study. There have been lots of studies about this. And so, what is the impact of these efforts? What is the impact of changing our pedagogy? And again, this is from the Center for Urban Education from the University of Southern California. And this reflects a very similar pattern, a very similar growth trajectory, going away from just thinking about populating our profession, populating our student populations with more racial or ethnic diversity, walking away from that deficit mindedness and walking more towards equity mindedness. There's some great resources that the Center for Urban Education, CUE, they have on their website. One of them is a scorecard. Most of their resources were built for those in higher education contexts, for university professors and that sort of thing. But I think there are lots of good lessons and good implications for us in library and information science. Yeah, and implications for our profession, for the populations that we serve, for all the things that we do, right? All the mission of libraries and archives, be it instruction, be it cataloging and metadata, thinking about collections and collections assessments. And most importantly, it is who we are, because, that's the one thing, the sort of default thing that we think about when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, racial equity. We think about representation of our workforce quite frequently. And when we think about the challenges that we have faced, even in that domain, even when there's so many programs through ALA and through ACRL and through ARL that were meant to fix the problem of the lack of diversity in our profession, right? But where are we? And why are we? Why has there been relative stasis in representation of communities of color within our organizations? And I offer these as maybe some reasons, right? Emphasis on recruitment, as that recruitment is going to be the panacea, right? We've talked a lot about deficit model interventions, that we're mentoring these people to be like us, to be like majority cultures, and to act like and to value the things that people in majority cultures and identities do. The failure of accountability of institutions at the sector, societal levels. Often you know, we saw this a lot last summer. There's a student protest, or there is an incident on campus, and there's a formulation of a committee or the formulation of a task force. And those committees, those task force often have very little power, have very little resources in the way of financial resources. They have very little ability to affect real change. Lack of common vocabulary, the failure to acknowledge and counter oppressive systems, unfortunately, the tendency to incite polarities. And this is something that I will probably have to end with here, even though I think I have about 30 more slides, but that's okay. This is really vexing to me, because we so often see these issues as affiliated with conservative ideals as opposed to liberal ideals. As someone who grew up in a socially conservative environment and background, I actually see tremendous alignment between the concept of equity, the concept of racial equity or gender equity, and how that aligns with many conservative values. And we don't see it that way. You know, it's at one end of the room or what at the other end of the room, and it's very difficult to you know, to create those bridges. And then often our interventions are about a program. You know, ARL, for all of its efforts, we were able to recruit something in the way of 15, 20, 25 students into the flagship diversity recruitment program, the Kaleidoscope program. When we think about recruitment at that level, where as compared to the overall size of our workforce, I mean, how much of an impact is that? I mean, yes, it's tremendous impact at an individual level, maybe even at a mezzo level, if we think about sociology for a moment and the impact that it's having on professional organizations and some of the organizations in which these scholars are embedded and are doing really substantive, I think, important work. But for the most part, these interventions are at superficial levels. So there is so much more I wanted to share with you. We're not gonna get there, but I'm going to just walk through. I mean, just go to the very end.
Mark, we
I
do
will
have
share
a
these.
few
Go
minutes.
ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. We're scheduled to go till 5:15. So
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to you know, create some space for conversation, for
Okay,
for
awesome.
questions and that sort of thing. I'll go to just to this slide right here, or this is again. Here we go. These last two slides, yeah. These are some other tools, other processes that I think I would love to point you to, and of course we will share these slides with you. The intergroup dialogue model at the University of Michigan, is a facilitation process. The Northwestern University actually created something called Change Makers, which is a cohort model where they recruited people from across campus to go through this developmental experience together, to talk about and dive into the literature with respect to difference, with respect to racial equity, that sort of thing. The National Coalition Building Institute is another model. The libraries at the University of Florida, excuse me, Florida State University, have used this, as well as many other institutions. I have learned and grown tremendously from my experience as a consumer of the Racial Equity Institute in Greensboro, North Carolina. The Association of American Colleges and Universities, as well as ALA, have engaged in the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation methodology, where that engages racial healing circles. And I have found that to be a very powerful experience. The Center for Urban Education I cited a little bit earlier, that has tremendous resources that are openly available, freely available. This is one. Equity in the Center is something I have just started to investigate, and I'm actually going through some training through Equity in the Center, and they have a pretty complex framework called Awake to Woke to Work. That's hard to say. There are many solid principles about that. One of them that I walked away from in that model is that when we think about things like climate assessment, assessing, engaging the experiences of, as an example, communities of color in LIS, in libraries and archives work, that we have to disaggregate the data, right? We have to be in a position where where people can be open about sharing their experiences within the workplace and environment and in other environments. And we just have to position ourselves to hear some really hard truths. And that's difficult, you know, when we think about, you know, anonymity, when we think about maybe institutions and organizations where there's fear of retribution for sharing, you know, hard truths. I mean, there's a lot there, but we really have to look at those disaggregated data. And this is tremendous. The Coalition for Diversity, Inclusion, and Scholarly Communication, I actually shared with you just what the tenets of that are, being conscious of white advantage, of the historical um, um, buildup of not only white advantage, but disadvantage, tremendous disadvantage for communities of color that have been supported by laws in the United States and Canada, as well as policies and practices and norms, that we listen to Black, Indigenous, and people of color without judgment or defensiveness, that we move out of our social segregated circles and develop truth-telling relationships of accountability with diverse groups of people without, I might add, overburdening them, overburdening us to share our stories. That we take action to interrupt racism and white advantage at all levels. And there's so many good tools for doing that and frameworks, and that we create more communities where everyone thrives. It's a tremendous, you'll just Google C4DISC and the anti-racism toolkit. Some that we're working, there's a large group, this comes from largely the scholarly publishing community, and we're in the process of building similar toolkits for communities of color, and also for looking at anti-racism within an organizational or institutional context. So thank you. Committing to work as leaders. This is what I think we need to do. We need to define our constituency groups, right? We need to examine this through a lens of historical systemic disadvantage. I actually had somebody tell me that when they think about diversity, that they think about things like, you know, anyway, I don't want to go. The systemic disadvantage is the thing there, that we commit to personal and organizational growth and engaging in that often uncomfortable work, that we develop skills to manage and leverage controversy and discomfort, right? That we leverage local expertise and opportunities, that we develop the skills within our organizations, the capacity, especially for people from majority cultures and identities, to bear that weight of affecting change, that we assess the climate, again, with those disaggregated data, that we implement strategies for leveraging our unique mission, our unique role of libraries, archives, et cetera, and aligning with broader institutional strategies where there's opportunity to do so, and that we prioritize and resource the work of group. If there's a diversity committee, right, if there's a diversity officer, that they have the power to effect change, and that titular leaders, right, that directors, that deans, that associate university librarians are also engaged in the work. And I realize that there are, you know, political dynamics there all the time, but this is what I bring to you as recommendations for how we engage in the work and hopefully bring greater efficacy in this work. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now, I promise. Let's hear some questions or maybe some comments, please.
Okay, yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to have a chance to get to everybody's questions. Really appreciate all the engagement.
Yes,
and one of the main
sure.
questions, pieces of feedback, is that everyone would love to hear a part 2. So,
oh goodness, okay.
Mark, if you are interested, you can let us know, and Clarence and I can go back to our committee and let them know that there's a lot of interest.
Always, yeah.
Okay, so we'll get to a few of the questions, and then a few people are also asking if the chat will be shared, which the answer is yes. We will we'll provide the chat as well as the recording in the follow-up.
And I'm happy if there's some calling, and if you want to pull out questions from the chat, that if you want to put it into a Google Doc and send it to me, I will, to the best of my abilities. I can answer those questions if they will work in that format too. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right. So first question is, how can you call out performative allyship?
Ooh, yeah.
Big question.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a hard question. I think, well, there are no easy questions in this space. Again, I think it's different for every person. I really do. I think that being honest is the best way to approach that when we feel like this allyship is performative, that it's somehow engaged because it's of only a value to that person or whatever that is. You know, from my leadership development, you know, putting my leadership development hat on. I mean, I think about, and it does take additional work, unfortunately, but I think about building out my political map in terms of, you know, testing my assumptions about that person or that group of people, about their intentions. And if it is indeed performative, then having robust and honest conversations about that. I mean, I'm reading something right now that many of you are probably familiar with, around facilitating courageous conversations, and you know, positioning yourself to be authentic about what you're trying to accomplish. I think at the end of the day, both you and the person performing this performative allyship want the same thing. And if you walk in with that assumption, then I think that that's going to provide an access point for you. But I think just doing it openly, honestly, reflecting how that person's behavior, the things they say, the things that they do impact you. Again, speaking from the I, is a way that you might be able to approach that, but also understanding that there is weight that you can't bear all the time, and we have to understand our limits. And without, yeah, we just have to understand our limits and know what those limitations are.
All right, and there were several questions around how to help an organization move beyond hiring diverse candidates to retention, to retaining.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. And I have a slide that I have in some presentations that I didn't have here, and it's the word culture about 15 times. It's about culture, and it's all about system. So the first step in that is allowing opportunities like this, allowing for people to be exposed to what some of these principles are, and most importantly, how these principles play out. Again, if we look at the data, right? If we look at the data, you know, there's a Spectrum Scholarship Program, there's the ACRL Diversity Alliance, there's the ARL Kaleidoscope Program. If we look at the data, the trajectory, by the way, I don't think anybody has really looked at disaggregated data. So that would be a very interesting research project. But if we look at that trajectory and look at the degree to which, well, just the lack of progress that we have been able to make, I think that tells a very compelling story. And so I think, just again, positioning yourself to facilitate that transition, that paradigm shift, if you will, right, into that equity mindset, and to be thinking about you know, what it is about our institutions that have created the you know, that lack of representation, and that maintain the lack of representation. And I will say, and I have to be very, very honest with folks, I have counseled people, never telling them what to do, but I have counseled people who have made transitions out of librarianship. And you know, this is not to discount what I think is problematic about LIS and about our work environments and that sort of thing, about our culture, but there's nothing unique, unfortunately. These are challenges that people face across professional sectors, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work very, very hard. And in fact, in many ways, I think LIS, our discussions around things like critical pedagogy, critical race theory, in many ways are much more sophisticated than in other professional sectors. Do you have time for one more quick one?
I think we're probably, we're
We're
coming
done?
up
Okay,
actually on our time.
that's fair. That's fair.
So, and as everyone has said, it's very exciting, and there's many calls for a part 2. So we'll talk, and certainly we'll take that back to the committee. I want to thank all of the attendees and participants for all of your engagement and all of the things that you've said in the chat. And I'm going to call out Tawana in particular for all of those wonderful links. Thank you, and many other people as well. And of course, let's all thank Mark for his time, and hopefully we can have him back and do a part 2 sometime.
Very welcome. Thanks to all of you. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
Okay.